Welcome everyone to the third session of the Green Schoolyard Lecture Series. We are so happy that you're here. And today we will be hearing about embracing risky schoolyard play for exploration, learning, and growth. Dr. Mariana Brussoni will be discussing why beneficial risk and play is critical to children's well-being, as well as how to increase opportunities for risky play in the context of a green schoolyard. She also has been a longtime friend and colleague of the Green Schoolyards America, as well as the International School Grounds Alliance. So I'm going to pass it off to our CEO and founder, Sharon Danks, to introduce Mariana.
Thanks, Lauren. Hello, everybody. Thanks so much for coming today. We're glad you're here to join us for this special talk. And I'm so pleased to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Mariana Brussoni, who's one of the foremost experts on the topic of beneficial risk and play in the world. And I personally have been long inspired by her work. And I can tell you that our work at Green Schoolyards America has been influenced and shaped by her perspective. So really excited to share that she's here to share her work with you today. She's the founder and head of Outside Play Lab and a professor at the University of British Columbia Faculty of Medicine, the director of Human Early Learning Partnership, and investigator at the British Columbia Children's Hospital Research Institute. Her award-winning research investigates how to ensure children have the time, space, and freedom to play outside every day. You can learn more and follow her work at her website, outsideplay.org. And if you have questions for her, please add them to the chat and we'll address them during the Q&A time. Welcome, Mariana.
Thank you so much, Sharon. And it's such a pleasure to be here. And it's been really interesting to see who's on the call and see the kind of diverse experiences and interests that people have. And I'm excited to talk with you today. I hope it's going to be, it's hard to make this very interactive in this format, but please put your questions in the chat because I'd really like to see the kinds of things where you want me to kind of dig in a bit more. But really excited for our time together. What I wanted to share with you today was, well, I'll show you an outline in a moment, but before I go any further, I also want to acknowledge the beautiful territories that I am fortunate to be a part of today on the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam unceded territories, colloquially known as Vancouver, Canada, on the West Coast, and it is a very rainy day today. I don't know if you guys have the same kind of weather further down the coast. And just such a privilege and a pleasure to be on these lands, to raise my children on these lands, and to be able to benefit from the longtime stewardship of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people on these lands. So what we're going to talk about today at a high level is, first, I'm going to cover the research and the evidence as it stands now to support risky play. And this will be fairly high level because we don't have a heck of a lot of time. But I am happy to, if I go too high level and you want more details, then just ask for them. And we'll make sure to dig deeper on the stuff that you're finding particularly interesting. When it comes to children and risk, we have tremendous biases as adults and fears. So we're going to get into some of that. And I hope to pop some of those myths that are very common in this space and give you a little bit of, feeling more comfortable about kids doing this kind of play. And then we'll also explore some really practical strategies that have worked really well in schools to implement risky play. And I'll give you lots of additional places to look for resources. So hopefully that sounds great to you, but certainly pop things in the chat. I can't see the chat because I don't know where it's gone, but please feel free, Lauren, to interrupt me if something is like, it feels like this is a good time to dig further into that. Okay, so I love to hear, and maybe you can pop it in the chat and maybe I can find the chat at some point, but your favorite school play memory. Right? So when you think back to when you were in school, what were some of the experiences that you had that really stick to you that were ones that you loved and you really think would be lovely to have for children in schools today. So I'll give you a moment to put that in the chat, and I'll see if I can re-find the, here we go. I found the chat, that's good. You can throw them in there, and it's always just really fascinating to hear about that. Now I've been asking people about their favorite outdoor play or if their favorite play memories for a long time. And one of the really key themes around that is that they are outdoors, most typically, and they're often taking risks. And I see some of the ones that are already coming up that there's some risks that are already being mentioned. And so this is really, it's a big challenge for schools to offer this kind of play, but it is absolutely so critical. And so we have to think really, really carefully about how we can do a better job of supporting children accessing these kinds of plays. So when I talk about risky play, what do I mean? And essentially, this is the academic definition that we use. So it's thrilling and exciting forms of play involving uncertainty and the chance of physical injury. And this is based on Ellen Sandsetter's amazing work out of Norway. And I just want to kind of dig in a bit into this definition because there's a few really important elements that might be helpful for you to think about. The first is the thrill and excitement, right? So this comes from kids pushing themselves more than they typically have. They climb a little higher, they go a little faster, and those sorts of things. And you get that tickle in the tummy feeling, and these are actual quotes from Ellen's work that kids have said in terms of how this kind of play feels for them. The second aspect of this is the involvement with uncertainty. So the point is they don't know what's going to happen. And this is part of what drives adults crazy, but it is an absolutely critical part of this play. And when we dig further into the benefits of play, specifically for mental health, this characteristic is one of the most important. And then, of course, there's the chance of physical injury. And this is where I've really dug in because my own background is as a developmental psychologist and an injury prevention researcher. And so I've really dug in, how likely is it that kids are get injured? And how do we need to think actually bigger picture around why this kind of play, the role this kind of play has in actually developing kids' risk management skills and keeping them safe. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So just to give you some fun pictures, because it's always fun to look at kids playing, I'll give you some examples of risky play. So we've got play with heights, where we're, say, climbing trees. But as you can imagine, risky play can look quite different for different kids, right? So you can have kids that are the same age, developmental stage, etc. But one kid like this one is climbing to the top of the tree. But then you have kids who have less experience and are more tentative, and you can see that these kids are really kind of like, this is really fearful for them, and they're thinking very deeply around their next move. You've got play with speed, say like sledding or biking or running after each other, those sorts of things. Play with speed can also happen in kind of when you have affordances like hills or those sorts of things. Play with tools, and this, of course, is one that's pretty scary for most adults, kids engaging with tools, but tools also include a wide range of things. So it could also be, for example, scissors, which are a common part of every school. Play near dangerous elements. So this includes fire, water, cliffs, those sorts of things. And certainly play with fire is quite rare in schools, but it does happen. And it actually is quite an important, if we think about a connection to the land and our work with our Indigenous partners, play, like fire is such an important part of their culture and of the gathering of children. So another example, play with elements, is play near water, as in this case. There's also rough and tumble play, which can look a few different ways, such as this one, where the kids are really getting into it with these tires, or perhaps it's like with, snowball fighting. And this one also illustrates another kind of play, which is play with impact, where there's either the body is is impacting something, or sometimes it's like hitting with sticks, you know, hitting the ground or something, and there's an impact that reverberates through the body. There's hiding, which also is known as play where there's a chance of getting lost. So it could also be, for example, kids wandering their neighborhood without adult supervision or those sorts of things. So hopefully that gives you a sense, and actually it's kind of interesting to look at the stories in the chat, because maybe you can actually also identify the kinds of risky play that are coming up as different folks describe what they've been up to. So there's a few really key characteristics that are just a normal part of play that are actually quite critical to why this kind of play is so important, and the developmental aspects that really are hard to get from other kinds of play. And so just, you know, to name a few, you have kids that are engaging in this play because they want to, and they're voluntarily taking on extra cognitive load. They're doing creative problem solving because things are changing all the time and they have to shift, and oh, that didn't work, let's try something else. The play is constantly shifting itself because new things come into play, or there's differences of opinion. They have to you know, work with each other. So there's a lot of the social development that happens with play, you know, in terms of resolving disagreements or coming to agreement around what they want to do, or just figuring out how to include people who have different areas of comfort or interests. They have to manage the consequences. So things will happen, and they have to figure out how to deal with that. And that's a really, really important aspect. And I'll kind of tease that one a bit more in a bit. There's a lot of complex ideas in sequencing. If you watch kids, like, you know, for example, they're developing a new game, they're coming up with new rules or those sorts of things. It's a very complex and highly cognitively demanding task. And they have to keep in mind all sorts of different things, and remember what happened, and do some planning and so on. So it's incredibly cognitively intensive, and they want to do it. It's physically active. Kids are more physically active playing outdoors than they are indoors. The exposure to nature research is really strong around how important that aspect of it. They're engaging with each other, socially engaged. Because it's intrinsically motivated, they want to keep going at it. It's not an adult telling them that they have to do this. And then, of course, there's risk-taking, which has a whole bunch of different benefits that we'll dig into a little bit more. So I wanted to point out that this is rather incredible, actually, that last year, the Canadian Pediatric Society, so this is the body that oversees our pediatricians across this country, came out with this position statement indicating how important risky play is for kids. And in particular, outlining that they encourage their colleagues to think about prescribing risky play because it helps deal with the things that they are most likely to deal with in their pediatricians' offices: obesity, anxiety, and behavioral issues. And so for a body like that to come out with this kind of statement, you can imagine that there needs to be a lot of rigorous and strong evidence that that is the case. So just to kind of go over a little bit of that, the link between risky play and mental health, I think, is the one that's really intriguing to a lot of people. So I'm gonna spend a little bit more time kind of digging into that because it's important that you understand how that works. So there's a few different ways that occurs. And if I return to the definition of risky play, you'll recall it's thrilling and exciting forms of play where there's a chance if children are engaged with uncertainty and there's a chance of physical injury. I want to return to the concept of uncertainty because that is a key one here. So our world is an uncertain world. We don't know on any given day what's going to happen, and we have to navigate a lot of uncertainty. Now, as a society, and I include both US and Canada and many other Western nations, we have wanted to engineer out uncertainty. And we become less and less comfortable with it. We want to control more and more aspects of lives, especially when it comes to children. And it's very manifested in terms of children's access to risk and risky play and so on. The problem is that when you engineer out uncertainty, then children don't get the opportunity to microdose uncertainty that can build up their tolerance for it and also see it in the context of play as something that can be thrilling and exciting. That's something that they want to lean into, rather than something that's scary or dangerous that they want to pull away from, right? And so if you think about the difference between children who have anxiety disorders and children who don't, this is critical, because children with anxiety disorders are more likely to interpret a new stimuli, an uncertainty, as a danger or a hazard that they should pull away from, rather than an opportunity for a thrill or an excitement that they should lean into, right? And because they keep doing that, it kind of is it's a self kind of perpetuating mechanism, right? And so, for example, we have a colleague, Helen Dodd in the UK, who's a clinical psychologist, and she's doing some really pioneering work using risky play to manage anxiety in children, right? So really amazing. So there's also research around, reducing phobias, the importance of kind of kids being able to manage things, and when you engage with uncertainty and risk, things are going to go well and things are not going to go well. Sometimes you're going to get injured or other things are going to go wrong. And all of this is important because when things go well, it's like, wow, I did it. And I didn't have an adult to tell me how to do that. And when things go wrong, there's also the sense of, well, oh, well, that it wasn't, the sky didn't fall on me, right? I can actually manage when things go wrong. And those are both hugely, hugely important lessons to learn. And the other thing I would add, that doing this kind of activity in the context of play, where it is a relatively safe, and I'll cover the injury statistics in a moment, it's a relatively safe place for things to happen and the consequences are low, they can build up that tolerance for uncertainty without the likelihood of big consequences. And they have to build up that tolerance and develop their risk management skills that they will then have to transfer to other situations with much, much higher consequences, particularly as they get older. So hopefully that makes sense, but please feel free to add some questions into the chat as you have them. Okay, in terms of social development, this kind of play is very socially engaging, and which is absolutely critical in terms of children's social emotional learning. So the kids who are able to engage in this kind of outdoor and play with risks show more pro-social behavior, more generous, less aggressive, and more cooperative. One of the most robust findings is physical activity. It comes up again and again. It's just a really key finding that kids are more physically active when they're outdoors, and they're even more physically active when they're engaging in risky play. And so we are so worried about obesity and sedentary behavior. This is a very important aspect of it. And we also have to think about that physical activity beyond the physical body and obesity is actually really important for mental health and for cognitive functioning. So we want to make sure that it's a big part of kids' lives. I don't know if you're familiar with the term executive function, but this is the kinds of things that we need to really function on a day-to-day basis. They're cognitive skills that help us manage complex, goal-directed activities. We need working memory, attention, cognitive flexibility, self-regulation. And executive functioning, it predicts future educational attainment, income, health, well-being. It's absolutely critical. And we're not born with it. You have to practice it. And so it's really critical that children have these constant experiences to practice it. And so through play is an ideal way of doing it. And I think if you recall the characteristics of risky play that I mentioned earlier, so many of them are twigged and in use as they relate to executive functioning. Exposure to nature. I think this is a crowd I don't have to sell on this idea, but it's just incredibly important. So if kids can be out in nature, then fantastic. And I would actually further give you a little bit of research that, in terms of when we've been talking to schools, some of the arguments that we can make is that being out in nature, in green schoolyards, influences academic performance, and the mediator of that looks like it's executive functioning. And so being out in nature and playing helps support self-regulation, attentional control, working memory and processing, all of which can improve academic performance. So it's also important that there's routine exposure, right? It's not enough to just have a green schoolyard and go out there, let's do it once a week for an hour. The routine exposure is really important. And it's particularly amplified for children with ADHD and other complex disorders. And so these are the kids that have the hardest time being in a classroom and having their behavior regulated. And it's very exhausting for any kid, but particularly these kids, to sit in a classroom and still paying attention, etc. And that kind of deflates their cognitive energy. And so being outside, being able to engage in this kind of play, ideally also with teachers, being able to teach outside can have a huge impact on these kinds of kids. So I pointed out the Canadian Pediatric Society statement. You might also want to look at this statement. It's actually done by a group of people across the world, including American investigators, and we did 16 systematic reviews that fed into this. And so this is just the main statement, but you can dig into all sorts of details around why outdoor play is so important, and it also gets through around all ages, right? So it's not just for kids. Many of you may have seen this book, and it's been great in terms of really bringing attention to this issue. And Jonathan Haidt features our work and emphasizing the importance of, what's the antidote to a screen-based childhood is a return to a play-based childhood and independent exploration. So how do we make a difference for kids? And so there's 3 key ingredients that we talk about when it comes to outdoor risky play: time, space, and freedom. And so when it comes to these 3 things, what I'm talking about when I mean in terms of time, it's related to adults recognizing that this is important for kids to have these experiences every day. And so to prioritize them just the same way that we do eating or sleeping or whatever. And this is a particular issue for kids who have been overscheduled, or, recess has been shrunk at school, or everything else is seen as more important than play. And it really is the opposite. Space is thinking about, having stimulating, accessible spaces that kids can access with lots of affordances for play. And so we'll be talking about those in a moment. And then freedom, the biggest challenge to freedom, so that if kids are in these spaces, that they be allowed to play the way they choose. And we as adults are the biggest problem here. And so I want to just dig in for the next few slides in terms of what's the problem? What's going on in our heads that makes it so hard for us to let go and let kids play? And so you might want to throw in the chat, if you can, what do you think we're afraid of? What are the big fears that adults have around kids engaging in this kind of play? And because we don't have a heck of a lot of time, I'm just going to kind of tell you what I know about the top fears. And so liability is definitely one of them. Injuries, etc. Safety, but a specific kind of safety. So when we talk to parents, for example, there's 3 key things that they freak out about. The first is kidnapping. The second is cars, or major injuries around cars, or kids getting hit by cars. And the third is what other people will think of them. if they let their kids wander. And when you transfer that to the school environment, liability, in terms of what are other, like whether parents will be upset, and of course, just a really big fear about injuries. So I want to unpack, how likely is it that these things will happen? And I can't remember if I put the kidnapping stat in there, but if I didn't, I'll share that with you as well. So how likely is it that kids will actually get injured on a playground? And so this is Canadian data, and I apologize, I don't have US data, but I do know that the US patterns are very similar. And so to give you a sense, I looked across all of Canada, all death statistics for kids around fall-related injury deaths for ages 1 to 14. And so I can tell you that in the 2000 to 20, so the 23-year time frame that we're looking at for falls from trees in particular, at that same time, there were over 2,300 children across Canada that died in car crashes, in a car. So how many kids were dying from falls from play equipment or falls from trees? Almost none. Really, really negligible. And yet we're always putting our kids in cars, thinking that that's a way to keep them safe, when in fact, it's the leading cause of death. What about medically treated injuries? And so when we look at, so if you look at just the numbers of treated injuries that say show up in emergency departments or places like that, things related to sports and, leisure time and play top the list in terms of the numbers are higher. But once you look at the time spent doing the activity, then that puts it into perspective, because then sports have more injuries than play. And when I talk about medically treated injuries, these do tend to be very minor. So from things from sprains and strains and say stitches or things like that, even broken arms, but things that really we wouldn't consider as major injuries. And yet there isn't a call to get sports out of kids' lives, right? And so we really have a wonky sense of risk. And I'll just mention really quickly the kidnapping stats. Again, in Canada, the likelihood of kidnapping by a stranger is 1 in 14 million, which is like vanishingly rare. And yet we spend so much time and energy controlling children's movements to make this unlikely without thinking about how much harm it does to the kids. So when I talk to my injury prevention and public health colleagues, what I emphasize is keeping kids safe means letting them take risks. They need to have these experiences with risk, these microdosings with uncertainty, so that they can develop the risk management skills and the knowledge of themselves and the confidence to be able to manage these skills in other contexts. And in fact, we have research that's under review right now, where we've shown that these skills in play transfer to a pedestrian street crossing environment. And so to summarize all of that, I really want to emphasize that if we want our children to thrive in an unpredictable world, we need to let them play in unpredictable ways. Some of the way that I find that people sometimes find it helpful to think about this is to separate the idea of hazards versus risks. So as an adult, how can you think about, the school environment or how you're managing this kind of play for kids? The hazards are those things that kids might not have the lived experience, the cognitive capabilities to manage. And so it's adults' roles to think about that, to, if possible, involve the children in managing those hazards, but to deal with them so that kids can then engage with the risks, where they make decisions for themselves around how far they want to go and what they want to do and so on. And so our aim here is to keep kids as safe as necessary, not as safe as possible. And my wonderful colleague, Megan Zenny, who's a teacher, longtime teacher, teaching outdoors, and did her PhD in this, talks about yes spaces to make these kinds of experiences possible in schools. So for example, rather than telling kids they can't throw snowballs or they can't play with sticks, that you would have an area of the schoolyard where this activity is allowed and you supervise it appropriately. So there, I'll give you more resources where you can find more information on that sort of thing. The other thing I wanted to touch on, and I know there's been some questions around design, sometimes it's helpful to think about affordance theory. And so affordance theory is like, we want to maximize the flexibility of play spaces. And so when you have affordances like loose parts, where kids can move them around and allow their imagination to shape play, those will have more affordances than when you have fixed equipment that can only be used in a certain way. And so we often encourage, bringing in loose parts into the playground, sticks, mud, rocks, sand, crates, tarps, etc., so that kids can have those affordances for play. Now, we don't underestimate that this can be quite challenging in terms of the logistics for schools. So we actually have a tool, which I'll share with you in a moment, showing how this is done. And then we also have a book coming out that really digs into, how do you do this in schools? So I'll share those links with you in a moment. I think what's also important for us to recognize is that there is great inequity in kids being able to access this kind of play. And so schools are such an important place to balance out that inequity, because children are already there. And it's a wide range of children. And so if we can get them where they already spend their time and make sure that they have daily opportunities for this kind of play, it can be incredibly important. And thank you, Suzanne, for sharing affordance theory. It's a great link in there. So just some resources that you might be interested in. This outdoor playbook is a resource that we developed a few years ago specifically for, in Canada, it's the parent advisory committees in schools that do this work, but it could be anybody thinking about designing school grounds. And it's based on Susan Harrington's 7 C's of play space design. It's a really nice, easy way to kind of think about different opportunities. And there's lots of examples in there of how it's been done in different schools. For the teachers and principals and other administrators out there, this tool is based on Megan Zenny's PhD thesis. It has 16 different little videos with 16 topic areas that were based on teachers who are already teaching outdoors, the things that they want to share with their junior colleagues and that they wish they had known. And so it's just a kind of a little introductory, and you can dig deeper into resources in each of those modules, and it's free to access. So there's a wide variety of things, like, in addition to what is risky play, how do you teach math outdoors? How do you teach literacy outdoors? How do you deal with urban hazards? How do you deal with rural hazards? What is risk benefit assessment? All of that kind of stuff. So encourage you to dig into that. And also I mentioned that Megan Zenny and I have a book coming out. It's coming out in January. This is the link to yes, I'm very excited, Sharon, to the website where you can do a pre-order. Apparently, pre-orders help determine the print run. So it'd be great if you're interested to pre-order now so that they print enough copies of the book. Yeah, really excited to have that come out. And also, if you would like some support around this, the lab and Megan can offer support to different school districts around how do you do this work. So please feel free to reach out to me, and I'll put you in touch and we can sort that out. And so I would encourage and urge each of you to think about what's one simple thing you can do. We really urge people to think about, keep it simple, because this is a journey. So where can you start with one really, really easy, so easy it's almost mindless thing that you can do to help make a difference to the play opportunities for the children in your lives? And really just for all of us to feel really comfortable with the importance of taking chances, getting messy, and making mistakes. And you can find all of our material on the outsideplay.org website, and we're on various social media channels, Instagram, LinkedIn, et cetera, Facebook. You can find us at Outside Play UBC. And I will stop there, and I'm excited to hear some of the questions.
Thank you so much, Mariana. That was incredibly rich. And I was looking at the chat the whole time, and everyone had something to add to what you were talking about. We have lots of wonderful questions. And I'm going to encourage any of my colleagues to chime in. I think maybe one that is the most concrete, if you will, is looking again at those affordances for play and then connecting it with any like basic design guidelines or elements. I know that you said you have some links to things. Yeah, specifically for designers that are working on risky playground spaces, but also like what are some basic things that people can just plug in now?
Yeah. So the loose parts are really quite amazing, and they're like free to like really cheap. But they do require some curation, right? Because they do break, or you have to keep them fresh and so on. You have to make sure that there's enough of them so that kids aren't fighting over them. And I think Play Scotland had a really great um, a manual around loose parts. You could even Google loose parts Play Scotland, and they talk there about kind of the idea that you should have about 5 loose parts per kid, at a minimum. But yeah, so if you think about kind of the difference between, so like a stick, for example, and the bazillions of things that you could do with a stick, right? Versus something that doesn't move, or something that somebody has decided for you. Like, for example, a sword, a play sword. Somebody's already decided that that should look like a sword. And so that, even though it's kind of similar to a stick, it's kind of long and thin, the play is going to be different because it's already been coded with a certain kind of use, right? And the other thing with affordances is that the affordances are actualized by the kids. And so that means that they can only be actualized if that kid has that imagination around something, as well as the physical ability to engage in that. So a good example are trees, which afford climbing only if you can climb a tree. If you're in a wheelchair or something, then you can't use that affordance. And so it's important for designers to really think about, there's going to be diverse kids playing in this space, and you want to make sure to meet the needs of those diverse kids, right? And so while it's tempting for designers to have really kind of interesting, like, for example, pirate ships or things like that in play spaces, that reduces the affordances because you've already coded the kind of play that's in that space. And it can also increase the gender differences, right? Because if it's like, girls are less likely to engage and play with certain things that have been gender coded a certain way. And that's one of the beauties of nature, is that it's not gender coded, right? And so you do see much more diverse play when you have nature and natural materials in a space.
I've never thought of it that way. That's a beautiful example to encourage us to have more nature play. I want to leave a little space for Sharon to ask some questions.
I have a couple of things I wanted to ask about, and one of them is I appreciate the way that you were talking about risk and hazard, and so it makes me think of the use of language and how using language in different ways helps people to see different perspectives. And so I like, I think that we as a field need to be reclaiming the word risk and thinking about it as, something that it's anything you try for the first time is a risky endeavor. And therefore what we're trying to, avoid is hazard, as you were saying. And similarly, we try to, in our materials, never say the word safe, because safety we see as a marketing term that is something someone is trying to sell you something if they've labeled it as safe. And so it's more like we see it's more important to be specific. This is a healthy environment. This is a place where children will be out of, I don't know, like that being specific, free from injuries, or like there's a particular, like being more specific is more helpful than using safe. Do you find the same thing, or how do you use language to help people see what you'd like them to see in this field?
I hate the word safe for the reasons you say, as well as safety is a misnomer, right? Like we can never guarantee safety, right? And so, yes, we can try and reduce the likelihood of kind of serious injuries or deaths, but the world is uncertain, right? And so it's also it's setting us up for failure and expectations that aren't realistic, and also part of what got us into this mess is the idea that we can always have safe places, right? And so I hate that word. I try and kind of eliminate it from my vocabulary. And with respect to the word risky and risky play, I've often been asked, why do you use that word? You're just going to freak people out. Why don't you use challenging play or adventure play or just outdoor play? And I do in certain circumstances. So risky play, like you said, I feel we need to uncouple risk and hazard and danger, right? Those are not the same thing. And risk can have positive outcomes or negative outcomes. It's a neutral word. And so when I do kind of my societal level conversations, media, etc., and I write in the journal articles, I always use the word risky play to make sure that we are uncoupling it. And also because I often find, say people will say, oh yeah, adventurous play, challenging play, great. But then when kids start taking risks, they're like, no, but not that. And so you need to deal with it head on. But having said all of that, I do a lot of work with schools and childcare and parents and so on. And I also want to meet people where they're at. And so I do, when I'm in those kind of situations, I adjust my terminology to meet people where they're at and then use the things that are important to them and the language that they are comfortable with to kind of gently move them along, right? So it's kind of a two-tier or a different kind of approach depending on where I'm at.
Great. And along those lines, well, I guess using the word safe, the International School Grounds Alliance has a declaration on the benefits of risk that was written about 10 years ago and signed by, I don't know, people in about 50 different places all over the world. And the main theme of it was that school grounds should be designed to be as safe as necessary, not as safe as possible. Because safe as possible means, putting bubble wrapping the child. And so how do you, the balance of the two, and the wording there is like, I don't know if that's ideal anymore 10 years later, the wording, but the sentiment is one that I support. And I know there's a lot of good declarations or things like this that are guidance that you provide and others provide too. And I also wanted to ask about things that school districts and school boards can do to help to institutionalize these ideas if they agree, and give children a chance to grow in a way. Like how do we get past the like, oh, there's too much liability? And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to play policies, a little bit more about that spell out like things like the goals for, instead of, we found some success in having the ability to say, what do you want kids to learn at recess? You want them to learn from, have challenges that help them grow, get better balance, learn what their limits are, make friends, be, like setting things around goals. And then what do you need to develop in the infrastructure that makes that happen? What have you found? Is a play policy a useful tool for people to adopt, and how are there good models for them to follow?
Yeah, that's it's so important. I find the same thing, Sharon. What we want to, and even this applies to working with parents or childcare or schools, it's the same. It's really allowing people to think differently about their goals and values around this, right? And so the play policy or the play charter or play declaration or whatever you want to call it is a way of really digging into that for a school so that they can think about, why are we doing this? Why is this so important to us, right? And once they make that explicit and write it down and share it with the community and with each other, then it also acts as kind of a North Star for them to kind of like, so when all the yeah buts come up, including liability, it's an opportunity to be like, this is our North Star. We can deal with all of this other stuff because this is so important to us, right? And in fact, the Scotland toolkit that Megan, thank you, Megan Zenny, posted in the chat also has some guidance around creating play charters, in this case, in the case of early childhood education, but it's the same kind of thing. And with respect to liability, I mean, I know that Canada and the US have very different kind of, we're in different places in terms of that. But I do find in general, regardless of whether you're in Canada or the US, that people like liability is one of these dark clouds, massive dark cloud that actually has an outsized influence beyond what it should have. And so to give you an example of that, a lot of people preemptively don't do stuff or say no because they assume that the insurance company will be upset, that their risk managers will be upset, that the principal won't let them, etc., rather than opening up those conversations to see, like, this is a relationship, right? Let's figure this out together. Let's get to a place where, how do we get to yes? And so that everybody's actually comfortable with this. And I, like in Canada, we've had insurance companies fund our work and lawyers work with us. And we developed a risk benefit assessment framework funded by insurance companies and involving lawyers and risk managers in that work because they see it as beneficial to their business because it opens up a whole new area of business for them where they can provide insurance to these kinds of activities that others, other insurance agencies that don't have the kind of the refined understanding might shy away from, right? So I think we just have to think differently, right, around this.
And the framing, one piece of framing we found useful around that is to start from a place of like most adults at schools want to be that we want kids to grow up to be competent, capable adults. And the question of which piece of how much of that is the role of the school and where can the school help to have that goal of having kids be competent, capable adults who can navigate the world well, and structuring it, because then it's a debate about how much do we do and how much does the parent do, but everyone needs to do some. And so you get some, I don't know, sometimes that helps with buy-in.
I think to the equity part of it, right? Like we can't download all of this to parents. And we can't, especially because there's an inequity, in terms of, and you think about parents who are, say, single parents dealing with multiple jobs, living in a cramped apartment that doesn't have green space nearby, et cetera, all of these barriers. We need to think about this as we all have a responsibility to make sure that kids have these experiences. And so schools are just such an ideal place to like it's all our responsibility to make sure that children have the best childhood possible, and we'll all benefit from that.
About 20 years ago, I visited Sue Humphreys at Coombs in England. She's someone she's probably close to 90 now, has one of the field founders of Green Schoolyards around the world, right? Mariana knows her too. And when I was there and visited a pond and looked at the pond with Sue and said, how can you have a pond on your schoolyard? It's so hard for us to do this in the United States. And Sue looked at me and she said, England is an island. We need to be able to teach children water safety at the edge. And this is a place that's totally appropriate for preschoolers to learn how to be safe at the water's edge. And so that's, one really enlightened view of like what schools' roles are in teaching that. But
totally.
So Lauren, are there other questions we're missing here that I haven't?
I mean, there's so many, but I think the direction of this conversation is really, really fascinating. People have some specific questions, and if we don't get to them, we'll try to share them with the recording. I think that on that question of insurance, someone was asking about how this initiative changed how insurance companies do business, new products, consequences. I think anything you can share from that experience, or if you even have examples or templates of what they're using.
Well, maybe Megan, if you don't mind looking up the risk benefit assessment framework and throwing it in the chat, we can give the link to that. So and I'm speaking in the Canadian context, so I apologize. I haven't done this work in the States, but the reason that insurance companies were so interested, and then, they funded this work, and then they also funded us to provide training to their insurance adjusters, because the way they see it, if insurance adjusters can recognize solid risk benefit assessment, what does it look like when it's done well? then that actually reduces their openness to having to pay out claims for things that aren't, when things are done shoddily, right? And so from their perspective, this kind of thinking is actually very well aligned with their business. Because we are thinking systematically around how kids engage with risk, how we can think about the benefits of those risks, and how we can manage the hazards appropriately. Thank you, Megan. So you can see there's a link there to the Risk Benefit Assessment Toolkit. It is for the Canadian context, but there's some worksheets in there that I think will be very useful to anybody really to look through and kind of expand their thinking.
I think maybe a good place to sort of round out our conversation, there's a lot of people that were asking questions about age range and abilities, including as we shifted away from the pandemic and kids not having as much social time during that time, and fears of engaging with each other and engaging in risky play. Someone is asking about the ideal age for risky play engagement, as well as what like younger kids can do, but then also what that looks like for like middle school, high schoolers.
Yeah, I love this question.
And also from between like what's happening at like free play recess time versus teaching a math or a literature lesson outside.
Right. Okay. And we have 3 minutes, so or less than that. But first of all, age 0. Start at the beginning. If you think about how kids learn to walk, what is that? That's risky play, right? From the very beginning. And so it's not that also that, okay, kids age 4 should do this, kids age 8 should do this. Absolutely not. We return to the theory of affordances, and you want to provide that flexibility because kids will have different comfort levels, different needs for sensation seeking, and so on. And so you want as much flexibility around that as you can. And then, and here I would like, we don't have time for Megan to get on, and share, but she is the expert in how you do this in terms of teachers, right? And creating a school culture around this that can then bleed into recess so that you can actually be very accommodating for risks and risky play at recess because you've built a school culture. So have a look at the teacher tool, because there is actually videos on that, and pre-order our book, which is coming out in January, because there's a lot of really, really practical tips and tricks that Megan offers. And then also we are available to do extra consults if you want them.
Thank you, Mariana, for joining us today and taking the time and energy to inspire us and encourage people to honestly do what is best to encourage kids to have the best childhood. I loved what you said about that. I hope everyone has a wonderful day and a wonderful rest of their November.
Thanks, everyone. Great to hear from you.